Hi, and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, you have my October wrap-up. In this month, I finished my TBR for the first month in quite a while. I finished my TBR and then some. Now, slight caveat to say that it is October 30th. When I am filming this, I have one day left and technically one book left to finish, but I will finish this. However, I will not recap about this until November. I also will not include it in my book buying bingo stats. The way that I'm going to divide this up is I'm going to start with audiobooks and then ebooks, because with the exception of about half of my audiobooks, I do not have physical forms to hold up. So I'm going to start with the audiobooks, and I'm going to do 3 at once. And those are the first 3 books in the Rainwild Chronicles. That is Dragon Keeper, Dragon Haven, and City of Dragons. So I have purchased both Dragon Keeper and Dragon Haven. However, Dragon Keeper has not come from Waterstones yet because I do prefer this edition of it. So I will just hold up Dragon Haven while I talk about my experiences with the books. Now, out of all of the Realm of the Elderlings books, this series is my least favorite. But even saying that, I still really enjoyed them. I think it did suffer a little bit from the way that it was published, in the fact that I believe this was originally supposed to be a duology, but each of those books got split up. And so the plot arc didn't have a full and complete build up and denouement. And that definitely happened with Dragon Keeper and Dragon Haven. I have just started Blood of Dragons, and I'm seeing a little bit of that already with that, I'll call it duology, City of Dragons and Blood of Dragons. In Dragon Keeper, I wasn't necessarily as interested at the start. I thought that a lot of the characterizations of the women were a little bit weak. The women themselves, not the characterizations. Then we came to Dragon Haven, and Robin Hobb really stepped up the development of the characters, and I loved what she did and how she explored the transformation of these characters. And so ultimately, I did much prefer Dragon Haven to Dragon Keeper, which I think is typical. I rated Dragon Keeper 4 stars, and I believe this scraped into a 4.5 star. City of Dragons, you have a different aspect to it. You have more characters and perspectives involved, and I think that breathes a breath of fresh air into the book, because I think it had gotten a little bit stale, completely staying within all of the perspectives that you get here, which is just basically them going up the river to find a new location for the dragons. But in City of Dragons, you get Selden, Vestrit, you get Malta and Rain, you get Hestback, unfortunately, but I think the expansion was the breath of fresh air that it needed. I have not run City of Dragons through Compile yet, but I believe it will earn a high 4 stars, maybe a 4.5. Obviously, since they're 4.5, 4 stars, I love them, just not quite as much as the other trilogies. I did pause in between Dragon Haven and City of Dragons to listen to a couple other books on my TBR in audiobook form. The first of those was The Shattered Lens by Brandon Sanderson. This is book 4 in the Alcatraz vs. the Evil Librarians series. I love the zany madcap absurdism of this series and the way that Sanderson still keeps maturing Alcatraz as a character, as a narrator, and listening to it on an audiobook is fantastic. I believe I rated this a high 4 stars or a low 4.5 stars. The last book that I read via audiobook that I haven't talked about yet is A Very Private Woman by Nina Burleigh. I picked this book up at the really big, really cheap, really good book sale, and I'm glad I did. I wasn't sure at first because I thought it might be more telltale sort of thing. It's the life and unsolved murder of presidential mistress Mary Meyer. But the thing that Burleigh does in here, it's so much more. She gives even more of a setting of what went around Mary Meyer's life. And I think that's necessary because her diary, which she kept, it was destroyed. And that's one of the things that she talks about in here. So there was not a lot of firsthand accounts in here. I did enjoy it. It wasn't groundbreaking, but it did keep me intrigued. So I believe this was a low 4 stars. Then we move into the ebooks. Those were the arcs that I read this month. The first of those was We Deserve Monuments. As I mentioned in my reading vlogs, I think that this suffered a little bit because of my mindset going into it. I was not able to engage at first. I thought it was well written. I thought it dealt with things that were important. I just never really engaged with the main character. So I ended up rating it 3.5 stars. Then we have 2 lackluster nonfiction reads with The Women of Rothschild and This Is My Jail. I think both of them have literary merit. I think they were technically well written. However, with The Women of Rothschild, the thing that brought it down for me was there were so many women that were talked about, you couldn't keep them straight. It was really hard to keep them straight, keep things intact. At first, in the earlier generations, I was more interested in it than when it got to the later generations where it seemed like, oh, these are the trials and tribulations of rich women. Ended up with a high 3.5 stars from me. Then with This Is My Jail, it was either because I was super sleepy while I was reading it, or issues with the formatting because it was an e-arc, or potentially issues in that it didn't know what it wanted to be, whether it wanted to be a chronological story of what was going on or a thematic topical study, because it kept going back. It would move forward chronologically, but then it would circle back and it would talk thematically. And it gave a sort of whiplash where I already wasn't engaged with it, and then things would throw me off my game, basically. So I think it had a really good premise and I wanted to enjoy it, but it ended up with a low 3.5 stars for me. The last arc that I read was the Book of Everlasting Things, and going into it, it had been so long since I had requested it that I had no recollection of what it was. I thought potentially it was a fantasy. Turns out it was historical fiction. And I ended up talking about it with my mom and stepdad and grandpa after I read it. For that reason, my rating is going to be higher than my frustration with the ending would indicate. My frustration with the ending brings it down. It is the story of 2 people who were torn apart by the partition of India. If you don't know anything about that history, it's tragic. There's so many heartbreaking stories that come out of it. And the way that the first half of the story was told really gripped me. There's so much tragedy and trauma that occurred to these characters. And the way that the author, whose name I'm not going to attempt to pronounce because I don't want to butcher it, the way that this author portrayed it was absolutely fantastic. Then, towards about the 85% mark, things have happened where there's a potential for a resolution that you would enjoy, for a resolution that would, say, bring some positivity back to these people's lives. But do they take it? No. Instead, they take this possibility and they just self-flagellate. They have to pay penance for all these things, and like, it wasn't your fault. Stop it. And that is what lowered this in my estimation, but I believe I will end up giving it a 4 stars. If the angle has changed, it's because I had to change out the battery. Now we get into the physical books that I read in the month. We will start with the first book that I read in the month, and that is A Brightness Long Ago by Guy Gavriel Kay. This is a book that I got, I believe, in the very first My Coffee and Book Club subscription that I ever got. I had heard nothing about Guy Gavriel Kay before getting this book. Now, since getting this book and reading his name, I have heard a little bit about it on BookTube, but not much. And in this is very lightly fantasy. It's more of historical fiction in a fantastical setting without anything that would be not of our world. And I enjoyed it a lot more than I thought I was going to. The setting, the way that it was weaving in medieval Italy, I really enjoyed it. There were a few things in it that I could have done without, but overall this gets a low 4 stars for me. Next we have La Casa en Mango Street, which is a book I read mostly in September but did finish in October. This is the book that I was reading in Spanish, as I read a little bit every day to try to keep up my fluency with Spanish And I have read this in English before, which helped. Honestly, I do not remember much of what I thought about it, so I'm not going to have a very long wrap up for this. And I believe I rated it 4 stars. I might have also left it unrated because I read it in Spanish. Next we have Spin the Dawn and Unravel the Dusk. I'll hold up just Spin the Dawn. I read these for the weekend of Daddy Ray Reads Book-a-thon Gym, and I absolutely adore the Six Crimson Cranes duology by this same author, and knew that I had to get these and give these a chance. I thought they were good. They did not, in my mind, live up to Six Crimson Cranes and the Dragon's Promise. Perhaps if I had read these first instead of Six Crimson Cranes and the Dragon's Promise, maybe I would have liked these more. Maybe not. They were really good, feel-good reads, fairly predictable in a lot of it, but because I knew how Elizabeth Lim builds her plots, where they have some, I guess you could call them false climaxes, I was ready for them. And so I did enjoy these. I believe both of them ended up with low 4 stars. Next we have the first of my Book of the Month books that I read, and that is Bronze Drum. This book took me completely by surprise. This book is not a book that I would have picked up if it had not been one of the Book of the Month selections. However, I was really interested in it, and it's definitely very literary. It's literary historical fiction set in Korea around the time of 70 CE. It tells the story of how these, what were the precursors to modern day Vietnam, how these women tried to rebel against the Han Chinese, who were their oppressors at the time. And it's just absolutely beautiful. It's a storytelling that is familiar to The Garden of the Evening Mists, which this book right here, which did make it into my top 10 last year. And for that reason, I really enjoyed it. I know it's gotten lower ratings because people expect it to be more character driven, but this is a mythological story that's being told here. And for that, because I realized that, I kept that in mind as I was reading it, and I think that made a big difference. So I did end up rating this 4.5 stars. I next went into The Red Palace, which is the first of the TBR Tailored Book Selection books that I have read, and I think it suffered both from some comparison to Bronze Drum, because this is also set in Korea but about 1700 years later, and also from the fact that I did not realize that it was YA. Afterwards, when I realized that it was YA, I think that would have changed my expectations going into it. I will be keeping this, obviously, and I did enjoy it, but I was missing a lot more of the depth and character explorations and explorations of societal themes that I had just gotten in the Bronze Drum. This is a historical murder mystery, and I enjoyed it a lot more than I thought I was going to. I did end up rating it about 4 stars, a low 4 stars, but I think it probably would have gotten up to a 4.5 stars had I realized going into it that it was YA, and specifically YA. Then we have the Book of the Month, Words of Radiance. Can anything compare to Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archive? Probably only another book from the Stormlight Archive. This book consumed so much of my reading time in October, about 3 weeks worth, and I loved every second of what I was reading. The way that the characters develop, the way that the plot develops, the way that things are getting tied in. Literally can't say anything else because spoilers, hands down, best book of Brandon Sanderson that I have read yet. The other book that took up a lot of my reading time this month was Like Birds in a Cage, but I am so glad that I read it because I started this back in August and I put it on my TBR and I said, I am going to finish it this month, and I did. You can tell I really enjoyed it, and I mentioned in my blog the only reason there's no tabs in this section is because I literally ran out of tabs. This is a nonfiction art that I got from Library Thing. The subtitle tells you all you need to know about its theme. It's Christian Zionism's collusion in Israel's oppression of the Palestinian people. This is excellently written. It's more academic than I believe a lot of people might read, but it is definitely geared towards hitting all the things that I love. And I learned so much from reading this book. I highly recommend it, and I will be purchasing a finished copy. Unfortunately, I have to end it on a somewhat lackluster note because the last book that I read in the month of October was Island of the Aunts, and this was just a weird, strange book that had some really uncomfortable things mentioned in it, and I will not be holding on to it. I will definitely be linking the vlogs in the description below where I talk more about it. This probably is going to end up with a 2.5 stars. So there you have it. There are all of the books that I read in this month of October. I'm super excited that I finally finished my TBR and then some in the month. Stay tuned for my next book buying bingo and see how many tokens I managed to earn in the month and if I earned enough tokens to cover all the books that I bought. Thanks so much for watching. I hope to see you in the next one.